In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now, if you get the chance to preach a sermon, particularly in a church that uses a lectionary system where there are perhaps 2 or 3 readings every week, part of the game, part of the fun, is trying to guess what have these readings got to do with each other. Because this reading from Acts that Anne just read about 10 minutes ago is about the conversion of Saul, who then becomes Paul. And we believe that happened 2 years after the Easter events. So why are we reading that this week? Well, I think maybe it's a bit obvious. Maybe I'm being sort of just stupid and not seeing what is obviously a connection. First of all, that Paul himself wants to claim that he is, and he has a right to claim because it happened to him, because he talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15, about how he was like one untimely born, which kind of means he was born late kind of thing, after all the other disciples were appeared to. Even Paul, a couple of years later, Jesus appeared to him too. He wants to make that claim, and that's why he's an apostle, like the rest of them. So that's part of the thing that we have this, that don't forget Saul who became Paul, that Jesus appeared to him as well. But I think the more important thing is what it's what Saul sort of says in 1 Corinthians 15, which isn't the passage we have here, of course, but he is saying that the idea of witness to Jesus' resurrection is incredibly important. That just as he saw Christ, a vision of Christ, saw Christ appear to him, Christ speak to him, Christ tell him also he'd have to go off somewhere and then he would receive further instructions. We have a parallel to that in our story today from John 21, which we're going to focus on, the gospel story, where Jesus appears a third time, but it's maybe third time lucky in the sense that this time the disciples seem to really get that it is Jesus, and they really start to listen to him and sort of take instruction for him. And the idea that he says to Peter is, follow me. So it's a kind of a reset for the disciples, because remember the disciples at the time of the crucifixion ran away or hid, just kept very quiet about their faith, didn't want to be associated with Jesus, thought that the enterprise that Jesus had started with them some months and years ago had come to an end, but Jesus is saying to them, like, we can start again and I want you to follow me. And he gives a little bit more instructions to Peter, obviously, than just that. But this beautiful gospel story, and it is a beautiful story, I think. It's a story full of light. It's a story full of hope. It's also a story full of humour and humanity, I would say. There's a real sort of touch of light in our darkness here, I think. That Jesus comes to the disciples and he reaches them on their own ground. He goes to where they are at in their own everyday, normal lives of fishing. They've gone back to fish. Now, it's not that this is disapproved of. It's not that Jesus comes and says, what are you doing fishing? In fact, if anything, Jesus encourages them. He says, I can see you're not doing a very good job. Maybe you're a bit out of practice. You haven't been doing this fishing thing for a few years. Why don't you do something slightly different and put it on to the right, and you'll maybe find some fish there, and lo and behold, there are fish there where Jesus says there are. And here's Jesus looking from the shore, and he tells them what to do. Now, that must have rung a bell or two. In fact, the last time I was preaching here a couple of months ago, we were looking at the passage. Now, where is it again? I did make a note of it. Luke chapter 5, 6-7, where Jesus says to them, the disciples, 2 years back, maybe 3 years back, where he's summoning the disciples. This is the very first time Jesus meets the disciples at the shores of Galilee, and he tells them, cast your net on the other side and you'll find some fish. This is exactly the same thing that Jesus says to them again, and they must have thought, wait a minute, we've been here before with this. And it's happening when Jesus comes to them and shows them how to fish. So he actually teaches them how to do their job. So I think there's a bit of humour in that. I think there's a sense in which we're supposed to smile when we read that Jesus has come to them and approached them in familiar territory, but also at the same time has told them that they could do their own job a bit better. So their nets were breaking, just like the first time a couple of years ago when they'd hauled in a large amount of fish. And at some point during that, the light begins to dawn that this is Jesus standing on the shore. It's the person who first realizes it in verse 7 there is the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, this is a kind of way of referring, this is the author or the narrator of John's Gospel referring to himself, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was the one that was very close, the youngest disciple, so it's John, the young, sort of maybe late teenager. The rest were a bit older, or the other disciples, and Jesus kind of looked after the youngest one particularly. And he's the one they called the disciple who Jesus loved. And he seems that John's gospel is obviously kind of known as a spiritual gospel. John himself is somebody who has a very close-up kind of vision of Jesus. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes describe Jesus as kind of a wee bit at a distance. You know, Jesus did this, Jesus did that, he said this, he said that. John is a kind of up close and personal kind of gospel. And so it's quite fitting that it's the disciple, this disciple John, whom Jesus loves, he's the one that gets it first. He's the one for whom the penny drops right away, or pretty soon. It's the Lord. And Simon Peter wasn't so sure, but he sort of thought, well, maybe John's right on this one. He's been right before. Remember when John runs to the tomb on the morning of the resurrection, it's John who gets there first, and Peter sort of follows. So I think Peter's getting used to kind of follow John. If John, says something, then we should listen. I, Peter, am meant to be the leader of these disciples, but I've not always done a very good job. Certainly not when Jesus was taken away to be crucified. And therefore, John maybe is worth listening to. So I want to say that John is maybe not an official leader, but he is an influencer. Anyone these days can be an influencer if you can know how to work TikTok or whatever social media. You can be an influencer. It's amazing what people with, not that I can see any real apparent talent or gift or anything to say, nevertheless can have an awful lot of people following them. It's all part of the fun, I suppose. John didn't have an official role. He was seen as the lad, I suppose, or maybe a little bit nicer than that. He's the one that Jesus is really fond of. He's the young guy who comes around with us. And yet, he's the one that sees that it's Jesus. And Simon Peter, as I say, he's kind of half thinking, well, maybe it is Jesus, maybe it isn't. But just in case it is, I better put my clothes back on because I've got to meet Jesus. Why would you put your clothes on in order to jump into the sea? And he does that. He puts his clothes on because he's probably a bit embarrassed about having to see. If it is Jesus, I don't want to meet Jesus naked. I'm embarrassed enough. So I'll put my clothes on in order to see him as he jumps into the sea. Anyway, what did the rest of the disciples who are just a little behind and they're sort of gathering up the fish, what do they see when they get ashore? Well, it's a charcoal burner, or maybe it's a fire, just a fire perhaps, just sitting there on the beach. And when was the last time that Peter saw a coal fire? Well, on that Thursday night when Jesus was arrested, and Peter's hanging about, sort of seeing he doesn't want to get too close, and they accuse him, you're one of them, well, you're one of the Galileans that was with Jesus. He says, no, I never knew the man. So the last time Peter saw a fire like that, he had been denying Jesus. Remember, on the third occasion, the cock crew, because Jesus had said, when the cock crows the third time, you will have denied me 3 times. Or when the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. However, it's not as simple as that, because the charcoal fire is there, but there's also fish on it. So Peter is being kind of confronted with a memory, a fairly recent memory, of how he betrayed Jesus, let Jesus down. And yet there's a memory superimposed upon it because it takes them back to the time in John chapter 6 when Jesus fed the 5,000 with fish and loaves. And there's fish and bread here. Jesus is the provider. He's providing for his people. He's providing for the disciples. Now, he wants to say to them, you can provide too. So he says to his followers, bring some of the fish that you have just caught, and we can have a bigger breakfast. We can have a really good breakfast together. And it does seem that the breakfast takes a wee bit of a while, as it should. Probably was a slightly awkward breakfast to have. I don't know if you're probably not your best at breakfast, but these guys had been out fishing at least for an hour or two at sunrise, and they hadn't caught anything. So they were probably awake enough. But a bit like in Genesis, when Joseph and his brothers kind of meet again, and the brothers sort of realize it's Joseph who they thought was dead because they'd thrown him into a pit. And then they kind of realize, well, maybe this is this guy that we thought was dead. He's our brother. It must be a bit like that. That sort of sense of, what's Jesus going to say to us? Because we really let him down. Jesus is just, the only thing he said to them so far is, come and have breakfast. Well, that's a good start. And some of the commentators say, Jesus is a great mystery. The incarnation, that God became man, and John's gospel is very clear about that. The Word was with God, and the Word was God in the beginning, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen him and beheld his glory. And here he is, a mystery, and yet, for all that he's a mystery, the emphasis is on him revealing that mystery. The emphasis is not on him sort of saying, right, this is too mysterious for you guys to know. It's Jesus making himself accessible, saying things like, come and have breakfast with me. I'm not going to keep you at a distance. I want you to know me. I want you to have fellowship with me. Now, none of the disciples, as it says in verse 12, none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Now, because they knew that was the Lord, it's a funny kind of psychology there. They kind of knew it was him, and so they weren't going to say, just to make absolutely sure, who are you? And Jesus appeared to them. Now, this is something where I think what we're having here is a sense of Jesus revealing himself gradually. This is a third appearance to them. And then the third time they really get to see who it is, and they start to listen to him. But it's particularly Peter, I think, who has to do the listening. And Peter is about to be tested once again, or his faithfulness is going to be slightly called into question here. And this is where the focus of the passage is, where the passage really kind of narrows down to Jesus and Peter. So when they'd finished breakfast, all the other disciples sort of fade into the background, and Jesus turns to Simon Peter in verse 15 and says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Well, the first thing is that Jesus does not call him Peter. Peter was the name that Jesus had given Simon, son of John, during the campaign, as it were. You want to call it the nom de guerre, the kind of the battle name that Peter had. Is a kind of his name as the leader of the disciples, and who would be the leader of the church on you or on your confession, depending on how you take that. But Peter's central to the establishment of the people of God under Jesus. And he's the leader of the disciples. But Jesus does not use that name, Peter. The name Rock, Jesus could not use because Peter means rocky. Why would Jesus call somebody who's let him down Peter, rocky, dependable one? Because he hasn't been like that. So he's back to Simon. Simon, son of John, just as you were. And that must have hurt a bit when Simon heard himself addressed by his given sort of birth name, not by the name that Jesus had given him. Jesus had withdrawn that name from him. He must have felt quite sobered up. So Jesus then says, and then the Greek, of course, is slightly subtle here because it uses slightly different verbs. And some of the commentators say it doesn't really matter which verbs. There are different Greek words for love. If you've ever read C.S. Lewis's book on love, there is 4 words for the 4 loves. Thank you, Kevin. The 4 loves. He goes through how, and then of course people, next generation, say, well, C.S. Lewis was wrong. All these words basically just mean the same thing, or they don't mean anything all that different. And then people say, well, C.S. Lewis had a point, and are there differences? Now, I think there might be slight differences. You don't want to exaggerate this too much, but just to say that when Jesus asks Simon Peter, "Do you love me?" he uses the word agape. Agape. Do you agape me? And that's the kind of love that God has for his children, for his people, for the world. God so loved the world. It's a sort of self-giving love. It's a love that takes initiative. It's a love that's not necessarily doing it because he's been loved by somebody else first. It's a love because he loves, because he is love. That's a kind of godlike love. And he's saying so it's a kind of, let's call it charity. We could maybe use that old-fashioned English word. do you charity me more than these? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I, but he doesn't use that word. He says, I filio you. I filio, that means I really like you. I'm really your friend. You're my best buddy kind of thing. And there's a slight difference. I don't want to exaggerate too much, but it's a sense in which, and people might say, well, agape love is bigger, is higher than filial love. But actually, it might be the other way around in some sense, because although that's true, God's love is an agape love. Filial is a bit more an intense love. It's a bit more personal. And what he's saying, Peter is saying back to Jesus, is I don't just sort of love you because it's a good thing to love people, like I love all my brothers and all the world and everybody. I want to try and be loving like God is loving. I really filio you. I really actually like you. It's not, I just don't just love you, but I actually like you. And then Jesus asks the second time. What Jesus says, well, in response to that, well, if that's the case, then what's he going to say? He says, well, let's have a party, or let's go and take a holiday together or something, or let's sit down and talk. Jesus just says, well, feed my lambs. If you love me, next thing we're going to do, well, actually, over to you, feed my lambs. So, feed my followers, particularly the idea on the kind of the slightly more innocent followers, the people, the young ones who don't really know any better. Peter, you've got a job to do. I want you to be a pastor. And that's not the end of it. Jesus asks him again. Same agape, do you agape me? And Peter comes back and says, you know I filio you. And Jesus says, well, feed my sheep. So not just the nice lambs, but the dirty sheep, the older ones, the tougher ones, the ones that go astray, the ones that are not so sweet, the ones that cause the pastor trouble, and maybe get the pastor into trouble. Third time. And this time Jesus used the word filio. Do you filio me, Peter? Do you actually really like me? You've been claiming that twice now, that you really, really like me. But I'm calling that into question, maybe. Do you filio me? And he says to him, having felt quite hurt that he's being asked this, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus just doesn't then say, oh, well, in that case, then, we're good buddies again. We're best mates. We're a team. Let's go back. Let's kind of get the band back together kind of thing. There's nothing of that sort of personal closeness. Feed my sheep. Just do what I've told you. So the kind of reset, but this time, Peter is not to be the leader of the disciples. He's to go out and be a pastor, whoever those people might be that he comes across. But there's a bit of a sting in the tail, because you might think that being a pastor, perhaps in a quiet place somewhere in Galilee, a wee village or a town or something, might be quite a nice job. But apart from the sheep, of course, the sheep being the people who are sometimes a bit smelly and a bit difficult and wander off. Jesus says a bit more than that. He says, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. Just think about a young man, Peter was up until the point he followed Jesus. He went where he liked. He got up in the morning. Sometimes he went fishing. If he made enough money, he could go off and do what he liked the rest of the week or the month. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten the belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. And John, in a little bracket there in verse 19, has said this is the kind of death that by which Peter would glorify God. Now, it doesn't say anywhere in the New Testament that Peter dies. It doesn't actually talk about the death of Peter. We don't get it in the Acts of the Apostles, for example. Peter sort of disappears from the scene in the Acts of the Apostles somewhere around Acts 15. But in the 2nd century, there's a work called the Acts of Peter. We don't know who wrote it, or when it was written, exactly where it was written, much about it, but it's a story of things that Peter got up to, particularly when he was in Rome, that he moved to Rome for the last couple of decades of his life and lived there up until the time when Nero came to the throne and Nero persecuted the Christians. Paul happened to be there as well. Paul, we know from Acts 28, gets quite close to Rome, living outside Rome. Peter and Paul are in Rome at the same time, towards the end of their lives. Paul, according to tradition, is beheaded because he's a Roman citizen, so he gets to get beheaded. Peter is not a Roman citizen, he's a Jew from Palestine, nothing better than that, and he gets crucified. That's the tradition. And you might remember the famous thing where Peter thinks, I better get out of here because I'm in trouble, and he starts walking out of Rome, and he gets to that inn, and Jesus appears to him and says, Quo vadis, Petrus, quo vadis? Where are you going? Okay, I'll turn around again. And goes back into the city. And there is martyred. And so the tradition is that this is the case, that he's actually martyred upside down. He's crucified upside down. And this is Peter's own request, because he doesn't think he's worthy to be crucified just as the Lord was. So he gets crucified upside down. And they say, well, okay, well, you can have that if you want. And so we know that the church kind of knows this teaching because it's there in 3rd century writers like Origen who know this tradition. So, without going into any more detail than that, that's more than enough. Peter, and Jesus predicts it here, will, by being a pastor, that will lead to his death. By being faithful to his congregation in Rome and the important church that was there, he will have to lay down his life for Jesus through being a pastor of Jesus' sheep. How do we apply this to ourselves? Well, I think today, just in the last couple of minutes, I said it earlier on that perhaps you don't have to be a leader to be a leader. You don't have to be a pastor to be a pastor. This sort of idea that we are influencers, whether we like it or not, is actually the case. That we lead our lives and people sometimes are watching us, sometimes more than we think, or they could be. And so therefore, it's not just for pastors that this is addressed, although it can be obviously of a lesson to all pastors, this what Peter is being asked to do, and this kind of interview that he's having with Jesus. And the interesting thing is that John, who is describing this story, who's telling this story and describing these events, maybe because he overhears them or because Peter tells them later, or he's able to be somebody who is a visionary. He's a writer, of course. He writes things down a lot later on, probably a number of decades later on. The idea is that he goes to Patmos, he's exiled, and as a much older man, writes the Gospel of John and puts it all together on the basis of his own kind of eyewitness account of what went on. John, as I said, the writer of the Gospel, unlike Peter, who's a man of action, sometimes of inaction, but nevertheless a man of action, John is not like that. He's a quieter guy. He's someone who sees, observes, maybe writes things down. Remember that at the cross, Jesus says to his mother and John, you're standing together. Behold thy son, Mary, and to John, behold thy mother. And there's a sense in which he was close to Mary, we could surmise. But he's got a bit of the contemplative, a bit of the quietness, a bit of the accepting patience that Mary had. Some of that rubs off on John. But also some of the kind of the courage of Peter rubs off on him as well. So he's a quiet leader, the man who is writing this account. And he knows, I think, and one of the things about John's Gospel is it shows the value of undistracted attention, seeing the face of Jesus and the person of Jesus. Not just the things that Jesus does, not just the thing that Jesus says, but who Jesus is. And again, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are Gospels about Jesus doing and saying, the Gospel of John is a book about seeing and being. Just being in the presence of God and relating to God in Jesus Christ. Undistracted attention. Contemplation, not in any kind of fancy sense, but just paying attention in prayer. Getting away from clutter and busyness. It's also interesting that with Peter, Jesus doesn't tell Peter to do X, Y, and Z. He's not got a list of commands and instructions and strategies for him. He just says, pastor, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. And of course, the idea is not so much that Peter goes to Tesco and gets a lot of stuff and brings it to the sheep and says, here you are. Feeding a sheep for a shepherd is to take them to a place where they can feed. So it might be better to think, let my people or help my people to feed. So it's not that Peter is doing the feeding, but he's showing them where to feed and how to get food. So again, it's not so much about activity, but a kind of sense of letting people follow and being as you are and drawing on the presence of the Lord. So remember, I think, that we're all pastors to someone, somewhere, and probably closer to home than we think. And that requires, I think, a certain sense of, just like John probably already was, and Peter was learning to be someone who kept close to his Lord in prayer and following him with his life as well. The bit right at the very end, which we don't have in the reading today, is that Peter says, as I think a lot of us would do, just humanly, we would say, hey, but what about that other guy? What about him? What are you going to do with him? And Jesus says, that's none of your business. You play your own game. You do what I tell you. Don't compare yourself. We have these adverts that say, go compare. And Jesus said, no, don't go compare. Don't compare. Just you and me. Be grateful for what I'm doing with John or whoever. And support him. But stop comparing yourself. We don't have to go down in history for God to use us, for us to matter to God. We matter to God as it is. As we are faithful, as we survive, as we look to him in dependence in all darkness and times of aloneness, there will be a vision that God in Jesus Christ offers us. Amen.